Hello. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to go further in to an exploration of spirituality in childhood and adolescence, our natural spiritual endowment, how it unfolds and serves to help us thrive, connect, and flourish in the first 2 decades of life. I welcome you and invite you to put ideas into chat. And we have the exceptionally capable Catherine Ho with us, who is also going to jump in from time to time and help moderate and move us along. Some of you may have been at the talk this morning, in which I presented a great deal of science. Because some of us are coming to this having not seen the morning, I'm going to include some core pieces of science, but add quite a few others. And what makes the breakout room different from the keynote this morning is that I'm going to toggle between sharing science and offering you methods, exercises, practices that you might share with your patients, your own children, those with whom you work. I would hope that we could break maybe twice for question and discussion. We'll break at a natural break in the presentation, and then we'll hold a good 20 minutes at the end for discussion. Okay, let's jump in. So I'm going to share screen. And again, some of this, if you were there this morning, will be a refresher, I suppose, but I'm going to, again, focus on translation to lived practice. I'm joining you as a clinical scientist and clinical psychologist. For 20 years, I've been a professor at Columbia University, focusing on spirituality in mental health, development, flourishing, and more recently in the past 8-10 years, bringing the science from our lab, as well as that from other labs, into society as a blueprint to help seed a more spiritually supportive society. We focus on mental health and thriving. We also focus on schools, organizations. We work with the US Army. We work in partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services, higher ed, K-12. So anywhere that we come together is a place where we can realize our deeper, true spiritual nature, and anywhere that we come together can be rewritten to help support one another in this very deep and substantial level of connection. So the Spirituality Mind Body Institute is a place primarily of science. We also offer a graduate degree program, a master's in spiritual mind body concentration. And our master's students are oftentimes mid-career. They go on to be activists, that some of them are healers in a various range of forms. Many return to the job they had before they came, but do it in a new way. They are in a personal path, and we help people translate personal spiritual life into outward service. The three braids of SMBI, as we call it, are science, depth of discovery, and service. So today, as we talk about spirituality in childhood and adolescence, we're going to first start with a very brief history. When I started out in 1997, there was not a single peer review article on spirituality and mental health in any of the journals that define the field. American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, American Journal of Psychiatry were silent on spirituality and mental health, particularly in the first 2 decades. At the time, there were all sorts of heated theoretical debates, almost echoing of things that have gone on for hundreds of years, trying to define spirituality. And finally, in 1997, we got past that and recognized as a scientific community that we cannot define spirituality as scientists, but we do have a very good lens at looking at the impact of spiritual life on all other lines of development, flourishing, resilience, and recovery from mental health. Now, in the United States, just to frame this notion of spirituality, if I might invite you to envision an overlapping Venn diagram, spirituality, religion. About 2/3 of people say, I am spiritual and I am religious. My spiritual life is held in my prayers, my texts, the ceremonies and community of my faith tradition. About 30% of people say I am spiritual, but not religious. It's through nature, music, art, my family that I feel a deep spiritual connection. And a few people will say I am religious, but don't particularly relate to the notion of spiritual. No matter what tradition we may be from or in, and whether or not we would consider ourselves religious, the depth of spiritual experience is foundational to who we are. Every single person on earth was born an innately spiritual being. Just as we're cognitive, emotional, and physical beings, so too we are all inherently spiritual beings. Through the lens of science, how might that be seen? Well, the gold standard in science for determining the extent to which any trait is innate or socialized, or the balance therein, is a twin study. We look at twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factor out the degree of commonality as a function of shared genes and environment. So the deep capacity in us, our wiring through which we experience spiritual life, and this is not biological reductionism. We can only say the correlates, the docking station that go hand in hand with spiritual experience. 1/3 innate, 2/3 socialized. So we are all inherently spiritual beings. And yet the impact of 2/3 socialization is profound in shaping, occluding, or developing our innate spiritual capacity as we go through the first and second decade. With puberty is a surge marked by a 50% increase in the heritable contribution. And we see this over longitudinal twin studies, a biological clock. So whether or not we've ever been told, whether or not we're expecting it, with puberty, there is a surge in the hunger for transcendence, the delight and to connect, the nagging questions of the head, who am I? What is my meaning? What is the purpose? Actually, what is the purpose of all life? Does God exist? And everything you ever told me, Mom and Dad, can be upended, tossed in the air as I feel a deep driving sense to know myself. This is the time of spiritual individuation, where I need to feel in the resonance of my own inner heart something to be true in order to buy it, in order to own it. And this is a time in which, even if I have been deeply, deeply part of the family faith community and a real standout at my church, synagogue, or mosque, I might step back and question, is this really true? Do I really own this? I'll share a story of a young man I know who flew all the way across the country to return from his sophomore year in the early fall to be at home for the Jewish high holidays. And as he returned home on the Erev Yom Kippur, he and his mother walked to the synagogue. And standing outside the synagogue, he said, Mom, I don't know if I really believe this. I can't go in. And her response was, are you angry at me? Did I do something wrong? But he was really having a classic individuation moment. He'd flown all the way home with his mother in front of the synagogue to question if he really felt he believed in God, if he really believed that God recreated the earth, if he really believed that this was a day of atonement and we could be renewed. This was deep work. This is by far the deepest work that a late adolescent or young adult can do. And it is by far the most important work, because here we set the bedrock, the formation of the spiritual core. This is the foundation for the rest of our lives. How we are as we graduate at 18, 19 from college is with 90% stability how we are in the ensuing decades in terms of the realization of our innate capacity for spiritual life, that deep seat of perception through which we feel connected in a transcendent way to all life, a direct dynamic relationship with our higher power. It is not a belief, it is a deep capacity for being and living in a spiritual relationship with life. So when that opportunity is supported, we now know, since 97, now we have 23 years of science, there is nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly curative and as profoundly protective against the most prevalent forms of suffering in adolescence. Depression, addiction, and risk-taking are some of the leading forms of suffering, not to mention suicidality, in late adolescents and young adults. And as I shared this morning, a teen 1 standard deviation above as compared to below the mean and a strong personal spirituality is, as you can see here, robustly protected against these prevalent forms of suffering. This morning, I talked a bit about depression in particular, and I do want to highlight Ken Kendler and his colleagues showed that with each successive depressive episode, it's easier to get depressed the next time. Under the rain cloud of depression, I start to think in a depressogenic way. I am such a loser. I never do things right. I'm the one who gets depressed. I'm the one who can't see through. That type of depressogenic thinking makes the trip cord lower and lower and lower. But if instead of developing a depressogenic response, with your love and support and guidance, I access my spiritual core, I hear other narratives, I hear spiritually informed narratives, I can develop a spiritual response to suffering. And with each disappointment under the rain cloud, by way of analogy, I build the muscle. I am more able to respond and deepen and strengthen my spiritual awareness. And it is actually through these moments of suffering that I deepen and strengthen my spiritual perception. I write about a great deal of this science in The Spiritual Child. The spiritual, basically for, at that point, 15 years, I'd been doing science on spirituality and resilience, spirituality and renewal in teens and adolescents. And yet every day at pickup and drop off, as my own 3 children were in school, I realized that parents didn't have this, and it was starting to. So I wrote The Spiritual Child, and if you want to follow up on the studies, just flip to the back, and the reference section can literally just plug and paste in PsycInfo or Medline, and you can pull up original articles yourself to see what the science looks like and pursue your more specific interests. I will say that in the past now 5 years since I wrote The Spiritual Child, I have met hundreds, probably thousands of parents, and never have I met a parent who was truly surprised that their child was inherently spiritual. And I met people from all parts of the country, religious, non-religious, people from all different faith traditions and people in all different circumstances. And the sense that we, the parent community, must bond together to support the very finest in our children collectively. We, the parent community, must buttress the spiritual core of our children was glaringly obvious everywhere I went. It was most apparent in our parent communities where there had been clusters of suicides in Rye, New York, and Palo Alto. And I'm always quick to say my own institution, Columbia University, has had clusters of suicides. That said, there is a sense amongst parents and those who work with children, pediatricians, child and adolescent therapists, that we must actively reshape the formative culture around our children. 1/3 innate, 2/3 socialized. How we look at each other's children, what we talk about as parents, how we work collaboratively with our schools to support the spiritual core across traditions in an inclusive way. This will change the outcome for every single one of our children. And I'll share a brief anecdote. I have several children, one of whom is very academic and one of whom is focused in other directions. And I can share with you that standing outside the 3rd grade door some time ago, when the academic child walked out, there was a certain cluster of parents that would fawn on this child, and they were so excited because there's the academic child. And then the very sweet, wonderful other child would walk out of a classroom a couple doors down and no interest. So this idea that we're commodifying children, that they sort of sing for their supper and perform and they win accolades for what they do, their parts and pieces, their accomplishments, is toxically in the culture. We have pollution in the air, pollution in the water. We have the opportunity to reclaim how we look at one another's children, how we talk about one another's children, and who we are to each other as parents and as, you could say, special a special presence in our friends' children's lives. Now, when we do develop the 2/3 socialized, when the whole child is embraced and the spiritual core is seen and cultivated, we develop a way of seeing and perceiving. These are regions of perception and reflection that grow stronger over time. This is a map, a significance map of regions of cortical thickness, the cortex's processing power, and people with a sustained spiritual life over time. What's remarkable, if you think of the spiritual response to suffering, the strengthening of the muscle with each go around of difficulty or being doused by the rain cloud, is that these regions of perception, reflection, show not thickness but thinness in people with recurrent major depression, offering evidence of the possibility of spiritual life sustained over time as neuroprotective against recurrent major depression. This puts us in a position to view darkness, isolation, moments of the deep depressive inwardness as the opportunity, or a doorway, if you will, to an illumination, to a awakening, a deeper awareness of spiritual life. This is not a happy talk flight to goodness. This is through the hard work, through the tunnel of struggle, comes with support, with engagement of our deep spiritual capacity, the red brains, the capacity to see into our loss, our suffering, our isolation, the 52 card pickup of our rearranged world as a spiritual opening. And this, of course, is found across our faith traditions. Through the lens of science, it appears very much to be foundational to who we are, to how we are built. This inverted U-shaped curve is a statement of who we are. Along the x-axis line, along the x-axis is degree of struggle, degree of post-traumatic struggle. And up the y-axis is degree of growth. And what you see here is that for most of us, right there in the middle, and these are people who have suffered real trauma. This is a sample of over 3,000 vets. Meaningful trauma right there in the middle, a standard deviation on either side of the mean, is associated with significant growth. That is our nature. It's not that we get better and only when we're recovered do we grow. Growth and struggle go hand in hand. On the far left, you see people who maybe grew a little less, and that goes hand in hand with having struggled a little less. And on the far right are those of us who have struggled so much that we are perhaps flooded and need support. But it is our nature that growth and struggle go hand in hand, a deepening of the core. If we were to look at predictors of who and to what extent derive post-traumatic growth, the predictors actually include access to the struggle itself, flashbacks, memories, existential hollowness and nagging, and access to our spiritual awareness, the spiritual core. Those three predictors taken in community are the four most powerful predictors of post-traumatic spiritual growth. In this sample, Tsai and colleagues, TSAI, showed that 75% of vets with the diagnosis of PTSD also have meaningful levels of growth. Now, one area that I touched on very lightly here, I want to emphasize a bit more, I emphasized it in the keynote, is that we have never faced this level as a nation of suicidality in young people. It was unheard of 30 years ago. The rates, this is an epidemic, and the rate at which young people die by suicide rivals that of death by auto accidents in both high school and middle school. So in the same vein that we would, of course, teach our children, buckle up, always buckle up, click, we need to support the spiritual core, and we need to get ahead of this, which is something I do both in my work and with my own children. Wu and colleagues did this meta-analysis, a study of all studies. You pool all studies that meet a certain criteria for focus and quality at once into a bin, and you look at the huge aggregate sample. Here, 2,000 plus tragically completed suicides and over 5,000 matched controls, same demographic, same diagnosis, showed that there's a 62% decreased relative risk of completed suicide if I have a strong personal religion or spirituality, and 82% decreased relative risk for completed suicide if my strong personal spirituality or religious life is shared. To say that you could decrease risk of completed suicide by 4/5 is beyond anything reported in the literature. The only thing that would go hand in hand with that is the intergenerational transmission of religious life, which is 50% protective. So there's nothing in the clinical or social sciences that comes anywhere close to this. This is so robust that it needs to be the hallmark of how we think about suicide prevention. And in fact, I'm doing this work right now with the 18 through 22-year-olds in the US Army, who are no different than anyone else, right? It doesn't matter if I'm in the Army, if I'm at Columbia, if I'm, homeless, no matter who I am an innately spiritual being. And to the extent that my core is strengthened, I am protected against the most prevalent forms of suffering, including suicidality. Now, if you look at people to have built the red brain, if you will, that through each round of suffering, I deepened my spiritual life. And in fact, in a bout of major depression disorder, I deepened and strengthened my spirituality. On the other side, I came out with a stronger endorsement in a long-term clinical course study. We found two things. The first is that if at age 26 in a long-term clinical course study, this is American Journal of Psychiatry, Miller and Weissman, two of the articles authors, if at 26, I have a strong personal spirituality, by the time I am 38, I am 75% less likely to have had an episode of major depression, and I am 90% less likely to have had another episode of major depression if I am at high risk. Those of us who suffer the most are the ones who benefit most. So this is not a dalliance, it's not for the curious alone. This is foundational to recovery, to maintenance, to renewal. The other piece from the long-term clinical course study that I find particularly remarkable is that those who at age 26, as we were saying, had a strong spiritual core, were far more likely to have actually been depressed between 16 and 26. Going through middle, late adolescence, emerging adulthood, I am 2.5 times more likely to have struggled, to have had MDD, if I end up with a strong spiritual core at 26. This is the formative process. This is the emergence of spiritual life. What we see if we slip an EEG on those folks' head is that those people who recovered from depression through a deepening of the spiritual core give off a certain wavelength. They give off posterior high amplitude alpha, right back here, which I shared is where the yarmulke, where the many traditions cover the head, right back there. Well, alpha is the same wavelength given off if instead of recovering through a deepening of spiritual life, symptom alleviation is found through taking SSRIs. However, if you pull away the SSRIs, I very likely can become depressed again. SSRIs seem to be jump-starting, amongst other things, this felt sense of elevation, transcendence, connection. Alpha, as I shared, also is the same wavelength, high amplitude alpha, as Schumann's resonance, which is the wavelength from the Earth's crust up 1 mile. So the spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the same wavelength of nature, of creation. Let's talk about where we are in our cultural history. We have never had such low rates of religious observance. And while spiritual but not religious can be highly protective, the intergenerational transmission for the development onto the child of spirituality can be very catch as catch can. Religion comes with a language, a set of customs, a community, values, texts. Spiritual but not religious can bring all that, and it can be foremost embodied by the parent or grandparent, but it is a deliberate, intentional effort. What we are finding is that it's not entirely clear spiritual but not religious is being transmitted. And I'm going to tell it in terms of our story of alpha and the spiritual brain. Together with Craig Tankey, Myrna Weissman, and some others, in 2013, we published an article showing that the spiritually engaged brain vibrates at gives off high amplitude alpha after recovery. And we then replicated that finding in the next generation, those people's kids, generation 1, generation 2. Well, very recently, we looked at generation 3, the grandchildren in this sample. And what we found is that whereas spiritually oriented people have traditionally engaged in a state of being, a use of the brain that vibrates at alpha, this place of interconnection, this place of unity, in generation 3, we're not finding as much alpha. And I find that probably the worst thing I could have ever imagined, because I take that to be a disconnection from life itself, a disconnection from the sacred dialogue, a disconnection to the felt sense of unity. And with that fracturedness, we could naturally then see the association unfold with depression, with addiction, the back door, the hunt to transcendence, risk-taking, the we of it all, trying to reach that sense of buoyance, and of course, suicidality, the depths of despair, that I don't feel part of life itself, that I don't feel numinous and joyful and part of all, at least some of the time. Well, the loss of alpha, I think, is really the index of that. So knowing this as we do, the most important thing we can do for our children is not leave this to chance, not leave this willy-nilly, but actively form parent culture, school communities, youth group communities, treatment centers, and of course, all collective spaces that support the spiritual core. The most important, of course, being our homes. When we do, as I shared, we set up something that goes the distance. And in fact, in our studies on alpha, we found that how I am, thinking of generation 2 and generation 1, how in generation 2 I was 10 years ago in terms of a tendency to give off alpha remains stable. Whether or not I change faith traditions, still endorse being highly spiritual, the formative context of how I engage my red brain, how I learn to land and live throughout the day in a spiritual reality sticks. It is very deep, informative, and it sticks. So what else then happens? Well, as life unfolds, I teamed up with Sunir Luther, one of my colleagues of many years, and we found that how I graduate, right, predicts how I'm doing 6, 8 years out. And that 6, 8 years out, now I'm mean age 26, a lot else comes from having built the spiritual core. I am now much more likely to engage in community and service. I'm more likely to have found a faith community. I have found relationships of commitment. I'm partnered as opposed to swipe left, swipe right, which is just every parent's nightmare. And this is really, the thorn in the side of our era. I am 17 times less likely to engage in manipulative and sociopathic behavior because I see you as having a spiritual core, and I know you and I know myself as sacred. So this is another way of being. We set it up and it sticks. What else unfolds? I shared earlier this morning that the character strengths and virtues that inform so much of positive psychology actually do not sprinkle evenly amongst people. And I invited folks to think of people they know who are full of resilience, full of commitment, optimistic. And if I were to ask you how many people you're thinking of, very often the answer is 1. And that is because the character strengths and virtues cluster in the same young people. Those in red, who we love as much as anyone, are low in everything. And those in blue are high in everything. Green folks in the middle. And for blue, green, and red, effectively parallel lines, I am as full of this character strength of virtue, this entity of virtue, as I am on the far left, anchored in daily spiritual awareness, turning to God for guidance in times of difficulty, Allah, Hashem, the universe, higher power, viewing nature as sacred, as the cathedral of nature, my transcendent home, viewing my family as sacred, seeing life on bedrock that is alive, that is sacred. This is why, if we were to think of this developmental table, life unfolds entirely differently when I grapple with the developmental tasks of adolescence with a spiritual core and without. So, for instance, who am I? Well, that is the hallmark question of teens. And from the view of no spiritual core, I am the greatest mathematician in my whole grade. Actually, I'm kind of in the middle. I'm last. I was cut from JV tennis. Actually, I am playing number 2 on the ladder on varsity. I am my performance, my parts and pieces. Now, the day that it doesn't go so well, that's pretty devastating. If I'm the best at math and I just moved up to calculus BC and got a D, or even I got a B, I'm not the best anymore. My deep core is rattled. And I think that attachment to outcome, the attachment to my parts and pieces, the lack of felt sense of sitting deep in my spiritual core, my seat of being, has made young people profoundly vulnerable. Think of the rates of suicide. Now, what about if you raise me to know myself as a soul on earth, a being of infinite worth, a child of God? What if I know myself and feel myself as having a spiritual core? Then being good at math, well, that's nice. It's an endowment. It's a gift through which I can carve my contribution, my purpose, my signature calling. And the day it doesn't go well, that B in BC calculus, that D in BC, that's disappointing, but it doesn't rattle me to the core. That's not who I am. I am a child of God. I am a being of infinite worth. I am made of life itself. That's just noise, this disappointment, in the larger trajectory of my contribution and calling. Who are you? Well, if I'm a soul on earth, then you're a soul on earth. And I look past whether you have more or less of something, whether I think, what I think of your parts and pieces, to you. And our relationship becomes about interest, about encouragement, on a tough day, about forgiveness. But it's a relationship of deep spiritual connection. You've come into my life for a reason, and I into yours for a reason. And our relationship didn't fall like chips on the floor. It was purposeful. So this sense of being and relationality is entirely different from whether I look over and see parts and pieces. You got a 96 when I got an 86. I mean, you got into USC and I haven't gotten in anywhere. That relationship, the commodified relationship of measurement and competition, again, is a very lonely place to live. And we work with Columbia University students to help them deepen their sense of relationship so that the person, we have college students who sit in a crowded room. They could be 50, 100 students, and they feel totally alone. With or without COVID, they feel totally alone because the person next to me is my competitor. The person on the other side has more or less of something. But if I can look and use my higher self to look at your higher self, we have a shot at a profoundly significant relationship. So how do we see differently into life? Well, the red brains, as I put it up there, are brains that use different circuits. It's a spiritual use of the brain. And the spiritual use of the brain is a much broader scope of data. I will make a better decision, a more fully informed decision. And I will also make a decision that holds in balance the particulars of my interest with the unity of being. I'm more likely to engage the parietal, which toggles between uniqueness you and I have and the common seat of being that you and I share. So between this unitive versus distinct, point versus a wave awareness, and a broader scope of data, the capacity, instead of just charging by door number 1, 2, and 3, to be present and see them and be surprised by what pops, I will make a better decision, and I will even make a more loving, life-giving decision as the spiritual use of the brain invokes the same network of love and bonding that was brought forward in our parents' arms as a young child, the bonding network. When I can avail myself both of spiritual awareness and discernment, I can toggle between forms of knowing. I build highways, if you will, myelinated tracks between regions of the brain. And we found that a brain that has lived its life in quest where I ask a question of my purpose and then I receive awareness, inspiration, intuition, mystical knowing. When I can move between discernment and spiritual receptivity, I avail myself of more forms of knowing. I make a better decision, and I have, you could say, more optimal use of my brain. It's a better brain because it is highly interconnected, and it is a choice. We do this with our students at Columbia University. Following a year where there were 9 reported suicides, felt, how can I run the Spirituality Mind Body Institute and not cross the street and go help the undergraduates? Our program is an all-graduate program, and I took some wonderfully caring graduate students, and we crossed the street, and we now offer what we call awakened awareness seminars, and they blend science with practices to help realize our natural spiritual nature. And the undergraduates love it. In fact, they very often had hungered for this and sensed that they hungered for this, and were aware, many of them, that they were in a state of spiritual decline since their earlier years. And yet only when they found this practice of supportive awakening did they engage, spend the time, and very quickly, because this is just a quarter inch under the surface, start to realize their innate spiritual capacity. This is who we are. And knowing how protective the spiritual core is against our epidemic forms of suffering. David Brooks wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on the spiritual child, and he made the point that it's time to engage spiritual awareness and support for the child's spiritual core in the public square. We spoke a bit in the morning about developing spiritual multilingualism, so we don't need to be worried about bringing spiritual voice into the public square. It's not coercive if you speak in your first person and I speak in mine, and we have a deep engaged interest and a resonance and awareness of what one another are saying. Spiritual, at the moment, we are not a terribly spiritually conversant society, but this is our opportunity. We can teach our children, we can put this in schools. It is inclusive, it is pan and non-denominational. We are innately spiritual beings, right along being physical, emotional, cognitive beings. It is essential to reintegrate. And in fact, it appears that the spiritual form of awareness is command control, the superordinate. So without support for the spiritual core, the other lines are not integrated. So I invite us into discussion, and I would also like to share some practices. Why don't we do a Q&A, and then I'm going to do a practice for a younger child and a practice for a teen. Any thoughts or questions?
Hi, Dr. Miller. So we do have a couple questions from the audience. The first one I have sent to you from Stacy. Would you like to take a look at that and answer it?
Okay, thank you. Although I haven't had the opportunity to get to know you as an individual, so I couldn't speak to your personal journey, I can say in general, what we find is that about 2/3 of depressions in late adolescents and emerging adults are actually developmental depressions. That this booting up and hunger, who am I, what is my purpose, what is my meaning, the quest to connect with life, the field of life, to feel the unity. This process at moments feels buoyant and full of illumination, and might be likened to a lit up rock concert, and then in the next moment feels like a half empty glass of spirituality. When I speak with college counselors, that is indeed what I hear from them as well. 2/3 of my caseload is not psychopathology, as I learned in medical school. 2/3 of my college counseling caseload is developmental depression. It's existential reaching and metabolizing to access and develop spiritual awareness. Now, 1/3 of presentations in college with the college counselors with whom I've spoken have been MDD, and benefited from psychopharm and benefited from psychotherapy. So my point is that both exist, and sometimes, even if this is a classic MDD, which has a great deal of heterogeneity, enormous amounts of heterogeneity, there still is a deepening of the spiritual core to go hand in hand. Simply to lift the symptoms alone might be to deprive me of the opportunity to form the spiritual core, the spiritual response to suffering. So your box shared a bit more information, and it spoke to a time before late adolescence and emerging adulthood. So that could have a host of origins, and I haven't had the opportunity to meet you, but I will say that even if I am on a lifetime course of recurrent depression, and there's a biological underpinning and there's a family risk, I still am actually one who can benefit greatly from a spiritual cultivating, an awareness of how suffering may close one door but open another, a fostering of my relationship to God or love or the consciousness field. And in fact, at our studies of offspring at high and low risk for depression, together with Myrna Weissman's team, those of us at high risk benefit the most. We are actually perhaps more sensitive, more porous, recurrent depressives, along with our artists and musicians and shamans, more porous, more sensitive. Of all of the 5-factor, the well-known from psychology and clinical science, the 5-factor model of personality, the only dimension that goes hand in hand with spiritual awareness is openness to experience. Spiritual awareness is a perceptual seat of being. It's a perceptual stance, and openness to experience as a character, as a personality trait, facilitates that. So very often people with recurrent depression can be very exquisitely sensitive and profoundly spiritually deep. I want to add one more point, which is in the box you mentioned your age now. And it so happens that with midlife, there is again a deepening. Jung spoke of the second half of life, and people write of the dark night of the soul. In our long-term clinical course studies, we found that very spiritually oriented people who may derive a good deal of protected benefit in their late 20s and 30s and late 30s, as they enter the second half of life with midlife, very spiritual people often will have a very difficult struggle. The deeper we are, the deeper it hurts. The existential hunger. How have I used my life? Have I fulfilled my purpose? Have I fulfilled God's purpose for me? Have I lived out my values? And this existential dig is a moment of tremendous opportunity for the deepening of our spiritual core once again. And as I shared, as a midlife parent, this may be going on right during late adolescence, emerging adulthood for my child. So in tandem, we can share this, right? We both have skin in the game. This is a moment of deepening, of transformation. Again, as I become an elder, I have this opportunity. Life gives us these chances. And so too, life events give us these chances, moments of illumination, the birth of a child. I've had parents say, I didn't believe in anything, but then my daughter was born and I knew there was so much more. And I've had people say, I didn't believe in anything, and then I got ill, or then my grandmother got ill. And right at the edges of life and death, I think, the egg cracks and we have a tremendous amount of access and spiritual awareness. Other questions?
Yes, so we actually have 3 more questions. We'll get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. So I'm a clinical researcher and clinical psychologist in the area of pediatric mood disorders and suicide. I'm struck with your summary of research findings about spirituality and the lack of translation into psychosocial treatment. From your perspective, can this sort of spiritual deepening occur in a significant enough way in the context of other evidence-based psychosocial treatments for depression like CBT or MBCBT, or does it really need to be fostered through parenting or personal exploration? What is missing from our treatment approaches?
Fantastic. I'm so grateful you asked. Yes. And in fact, I'm so pleased you raised specifically the short-term structured therapies. By and large, they are silent on psychotherapy, which means they neither prescribe or don't prescribe, direct or don't direct. And I have found that at the level of relationality, the connective tissue, at the level of narrative and moment in the developmental path, right? In all of these ways, the spiritual voice finds a home. as you, the therapist, hold the awareness. I'll give you a couple examples. Using IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy, I was working with pregnant teens in Harlem a few years ago. And in fact, because these girls tended not to go to the clinic, I brought our IPT group into a high school in the Harlem area that was specifically at that time for pregnant and parenting teens. And we started a group which was essentially spiritually oriented IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy. The IPT formulation alone held that this is a young person, and in this case, oftentimes thrown out on the street, abandoned by her family, tossed out of her original school because she was pregnant, even though that's illegal, very often the case. And here was this young girl. In the eyes of IPT, it was essential that she individuate and, earlier than might otherwise have been the case, become a young adult. In doing so, IPT, in a very helpful way, holds it's a relational therapy that she needed to find mentors and older women or men. They tended to be women in this case, who were her guides, her stability, her people of resource, both emotional wisdom and material resource. So IPT was indeed helpful. These girls had to step out of being adolescents earlier. They had to move out of their boyfriend's apartment. Very often that was an unsafe place. There were drugs and guns, and they were right. And they would move in with, very often, the boyfriend's mother or an aunt, someone they joined with who could be a mentor, and they had to learn to step up. That all happened. And the whole thing was still depressing. They were still victims of horrible discrimination. And even with the support they needed, they were depressed. Why? Because their crossing of the bridge to motherhood had been completely disavowed, so much that they didn't know where they were and what it was to be a mother. And it was invalidated because they were young and because they were poor. What was spiritual? I showed them the Venus of Willendorf. As you know, the Venus of Willendorf is the first representation. Well, I'll put it this way. I said to the girls one day in group, what might you imagine was the first representation ever of a human being? Was it a man hunting drawn on the side of a cave? Was it a man wrestling or fighting? Where do you think we found the first representation of human beings? And they guessed warriors and so forth. And I said, well, and I brought out the Venus of Willendorf. I said, this Venus of Willendorf is a very fecund woman, very full, very fertile. Found little statues all over Central Asia into Europe from the Upper Paleolithic period. This was the first representation. She was about life and about the sacredness and the transcendence. She was carried everywhere. Why would she be carried everywhere? Because she was a sacred, transcendent, protective presence. You could have heard a pin drop, that their full pregnant bodies were sacred, that their full pregnant bodies were primary to the human experience. And from there, we talked about the inherent sacredness in the emergence of motherhood. They lit up and they started saying things to each other like, I was asked basically my boyfriend's gang's girlfriends, the girlfriends of the gang members said that I could have a crib, I could have diapers, and they would give me $300 if I swear my baby into a gang. Should I do it? And they all kind of thought about it. And we went through this process, right, of the sacredness of motherhood, the transformative process of stepping up to motherhood. And they all come back the next week and they're like, you can't swear your baby into a gang. What kind of mother swears her baby into a gang? And in the third week, the woman who asked comes back, young woman, and says, I've decided that I am not going to swear my baby into a gang. If he grows up and he becomes 14 and he joins a gang, that'll be his choice. But I'm his mother, and no mother swears their baby into a gang. So this idea that it wasn't just about survival, it wasn't just about landing, but I was more, not less, for becoming a mother in this ultimate sense, was really what turned the tide. And almost all, we ran 2 groups, and over 90% of the girls no longer met criteria for depression. And it was not because now they had a refrigerator. It was because they had arrived into the worthiness, the ultimate inherent sacred worthiness of motherhood. So there's an example. I think spirituality and any structured treatment go hand in hand. You hold the relationality, you hold the narrative, and you speaking from your own spiritual core, give them permission to do the same. Thank you. I
Thank you,
appreciate your
Dr.
time.
Miller. Thank you.